All right. So hello. My name's Michael Simonson. I'm the Director of Public Outreach at the Leo Beck Institute, as well as an archivist, the head of reference. I wanted to welcome everyone to another installation of our monthly book club. And this time we are discussing the book, The Golem of Brooklyn by Adam Mansbach, who is our guest today. I'm going to introduce Adam briefly here, actually by using the bio on the book itself. Adam Mansbach is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Go the F to Sleep, as well as the novels Rages Back, The End of the Jews, which was the winner of the California Book Award, An Angry Black White Boy, and the memoir-in-verse, I Had a Brother Once. With Dave Barry and Alan Zweibel, he co-authored For This We Left Egypt and the best-selling A Field Guide to the Jewish People. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, Esquire, The Believer, and The Guardian. So I wanted to welcome Adam today to join us, and he's going to begin today's event by giving a short opening presentation about the book. Then he will hand it back to me, and we will open it up for our usual discussion. Okay, so Adam, go ahead.
All right. Thank you guys for having me. Good to be here today. I'm joining you from Berkeley, California. I'll just talk a little bit about the golem, the figure of the golem, and then the golem in the book. Maybe talk briefly about the impetus to write the book, and then we'll just open it up. I'll try not to be too long-winded in my opening remarks. So in Jewish folklore, a golem is a creature made of mud or clay, 9 or 10 feet tall, always constructed and animated by a rabbi or a very wise, scholarly, observant, religious Jewish man, always at a time of crisis. And I don't just mean sort of the existential crisis of like the existence of anti-Semitism in the world. I mean an emergency, an immediate crisis, villagers marching with lit torches toward the Jewish quarter type crisis. There are, this being Judaism, of course, differing opinions, arguments, conflicts over hundreds of years about the exact recipe that one might use to animate a golem. I try to use words like animate and suscitate when I talk about the golem, because strictly speaking, the golem is not alive, nor is he dead. He is either up and about or he is clay. No one agrees on the recipe, the proper incantations, rituals, prayers to be recited and performed in order to suscitate the golem. But across the board, the final step in animating him always involves the Hebrew word for truth, which is either written on the golem's forehead or inscribed on a piece of paper that is then inserted into his mouth. The golem then comes alive. Sometimes the golem does the bidding of his creator. Sometimes he refuses to. Sometimes he's successful. Sometimes he fails spectacularly. In most tellings, he is a mindless brute with no particular will of his own. But there are also stories in which the golem is incredibly willful, incredibly unwilling to do as he's told, or incapable of doing it, or easily distracted, or easily tricked into doing the opposite of what his intended purpose is. As I said, he's usually brought into being for the martial defense of the Jewish people, which was the case for the most famous golem, the Golem of Prague, usually considered the Michael Jordan of golems. But sometimes the golem is animated simply for something as simple as manual labor, as was the case for the Golem of Helm, the Scottie Pippen of golems. When the golem's work is done, or when he's proven to be such a menace that he can no longer be kept around, the way that he is deactivated is by taking the Hebrew word for truth, erasing the aleph from it, turning the word truth into the word death, and deactivating, decommissioning, deanimating the golem. So the golem of this book is a little different on several important levels. First of all, he is not made by a learned, scholarly, observant, or religious man. He is made by a regular schmuck by the name of Len Bronstein, who is an art teacher in Brooklyn. And secondly, he is not brought to life, brought it, see, there you go. I can never prevent myself from saying he's not animated in response or reaction to any particular immediate crisis. Len makes him simply because Len has a large amount of clay on hand and is extremely stoned. So when Len creates this golem, the golem immediately starts raging at him in Yiddish, a language which Len does not speak, and trashing his apartment. Len is able to calm the golem down by placing him in front of a television, playing an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, and then he runs out into the wide world of Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in search of a translator. The only person he's heard speak Yiddish in his neighborhood is a woman he's never spoken to, who works at a bodega. And he once heard her curse out some yeshiva kids who came in to buy cigarettes. So he's like, aha. So he goes to this bodega to convince this total stranger to come back to his weird apartment and translate for this golem that he's made. This woman, whose name is Miri, is understandably skeptical about this entire escapade. We will find out in short order that Miri speaks Yiddish because she grew up nearby in a Hasidic sect, which she left as soon as she turned 18 because Miri is gay, and that is not a lifestyle that is particularly accepted in that sect or in that world. The golem will quickly learn to speak English by watching many episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm after accidentally ingesting a very large amount of LSD. And what we will learn is that this golem, unlike the golems of folklore, is a creature with an ancestral memory. So Len did not actually make this golem, he merely remade this golem. There's only been one golem throughout all of history, and he remembers every previous iteration of himself. He remembers what he did, who he did it to, why he did it, if anyone bothered to explain it to him. And as such, this golem is in some sense a repository of Jewish history and trauma, which are basically synonymous terms. What we will also quickly learn about this golem is that what he's been screaming at Len this entire time is, where's the crisis? It's inconceivable to him that he would have been brought into being again in the absence of some immediate task, some immediate threat. This is a question he will repeatedly ask until he gets a suitable answer much later in the book, when Miri shows him a video on her phone of the 2017 Charlottesville Unite the Right, Jews Will Not Replace Us, Tiki Torch marchers. And it's like, you want to know who's trying to kill the Jews? These guys. This is who's trying to kill the Jews. The golem is like, finally, we're getting somewhere. And he demands to be taken to wherever those guys are. And as luck has it, there's a rally that is scheduled to take place in a couple of days' time in a town called Wagner, Kentucky, which I made up. Kentucky is real. That is going to attract a similar cross-section of the far right. So the golem demands to be taken there, setting up eventually a kind of moral reckoning that Len and Miri find themselves grappling with and on opposite sides of, because ultimately what they have to contend with is that they only have two choices. They can let the golem run amok and slaughter the enemies of the Jews, in which case they might be safe, but in which case on some essential level, some moral, spiritual, essential level, they may no longer be Jewish. This action may be so anathema to the values that they hold and the values they associate with Judaism, that in the service of trying to save and preserve and protect, they may have actually sacrificed something essential of themselves. That's option number one. Option number two is that they erase the Aleph, turn truth to death, and kill the golem. And that's sort of eventually where we get. But there are many twists and turns along the way. Having a golem with an ancestral memory allowed me to dip in and out of this timeline and also tell stories of the golem's previous adventures in places like 5th century Babylon, 11th century Spain, ancient Egypt, the dawn of creation, and so on. This is a book that's very committed to kind of telling stories within stories, much like the Talmud. I'll talk for a second about sort of the impetus behind the book. For me, my writing process often involves noodling simultaneously on disparate ideas in the hopes that one of them will emerge and show itself as worthy of writing an entire book about. And for several months, I was sort of rolling over, noodling on two different ideas at the same time. One of them was the simple comic premise of a golem created by someone totally unqualified to make a golem. That just seemed funny to me. I had this image in my mind of a regular, secular, not particularly well-educated, not particularly observant guy who manages to bring a golem to life. And the golem is just like screaming at him in a language he doesn't understand and trashing his apartment. That just seemed funny to me. But, you know, that's not a novel. That's like a Saturday Night Live skit, right? That's like the kind of Saturday Night Live skit that's funny for 2 minutes and then drags on interminably for like another 9. And you're like, did anyone bother to write an ending to this skit? Like, where are they going anywhere with this? Like, when's the musical guest coming on? So that was one idea. And then very much separate from that, I was also grappling with a very heady, thorny, complex idea for a kind of science fiction, speculative future novel about epigenetics. Epigenetics is the increasingly scientifically accepted and supported notion that trauma of sufficient magnitude can enter the DNA and actually be passed down in the DNA, passed down genetically from parent to child to grandparent and so on. That events of that are just incredibly traumatic can sort of flip switches in the DNA, activate things that were dormant, deactivate things that were active. You can probably tell that I am not an evolutionary biologist by the vague way that I talk about this, but on a conceptual level, I find it very interesting and sort of the confirmation of something that we've long understood to be true. So I started thinking about sort of the possible future of scientific discovery in this field of epigenetics. If we can establish that trauma affects the DNA, perhaps after that, the next thing we can establish is the exact moment when it happens, when the trauma enters the genetic record. And if we could establish that, we could litigate. We could sue the institutions, the governments who caused that trauma to enter our DNA. So, you know, you're an Ashkenazi Jew and the trauma enters in this particular year, when there was this pogrom, or you're of African descent and the epigenetic trauma appears during the period of Middle Passage or transatlantic slavery or whatever, you can begin to figure out who you can hold responsible. My notion in the novel was that this would upend the world economy in profound ways. And my thinking was that the next innovation after that would be the ability to transplant this genetic trauma from a donor to a recipient, which people might do for financial purposes if this trauma was financially valuable. They might also do it if people were paying 20 cents on the dollar for it. People might also make interesting choices about whether to reveal that they had this trauma because the political winds could blow in different directions. It's not hard to imagine a world in which revealing that you have this trauma makes you less, makes you damaged, makes you less able to get hired for a job, for example. So there are all kinds of complex calculations about whether to stash this trauma, whether to reveal it, whether to get the test, whether to take the payout. And in my world of this book, these transplants take place illegally on a kind of black market. And in a surprise to everybody, the recipients of these transplants begin to experience in a kind of waking nightmare form the actual events that caused the trauma. So these people now have a visceral connection to a trauma that is not their own, that in some cases is hundreds of years old, that they have paid to have inserted into their bodies. Anyway, I was thinking about a novel like this, but not to get overly technical, a novel tends to need things like characters and a plot. And I didn't have any of that. I just had this sort of concept. And then one day I woke up and I had this kind of eureka moment. And I realized that if I made the golem a creature with an ancestral memory, I could explore all of the things I wanted to explore in this epigenetics novel through the vehicle of the golem. The word golem appears only once in the Torah, and it's not in reference to this creature. It's in reference to Adam before God fills him with the breath of life. And it's often translated as unfinished thing. But an alternate translation that I like and find more compelling and more poetic is empty vessel. So in my thinking, my intervention in the kind of lore of the golem was to turn the golem from an empty vessel to a very full vessel, an embodiment of history, who's also only been around at the very worst and most violent parts of Jewish history. And once I realized that I could do that, it began to feel to me like a novel. So I sat down that morning and I wrote about a 5-page outline of the Golem of Brooklyn. And I sent it to my agent, who responded with a 1-line email. He said, "The golem market is dead." And I was like, great, cool. To be fair, this is also the agent who told me that he could not sell Go the Fuck to Sleep. So the real question here is, why do I not fire Richard? But that was what it took to get me started. From that point forward, everything began to feel exciting and vibrant, and I began to sort of write downhill. I was able to draw on and pull from a lot of research I'd already done, not so much on the golem, but on other aspects and elements that got pulled into this story. Miri's background, growing up in a Hasidic sect, for example, I had done a lot of research on the Satmars in particular for a TV project I'd been working on. So I was able to draw on all of that. The golem, we learn, has been absent from the world since 1941. The last time he appeared on Earth was in 1941 in Kiev, Ukraine, when he was machine gunned by German soldiers and cast into the Babin Yar Gorge, along with 33,000 other Jews who were murdered in a 36-hour period in what we think of now in retrospect as the early part of the war, the Holocaust by bullets. In real life, there were only 25 survivors of that massacre. In the world of the Golem of Brooklyn, one of those survivors is the 7-year-old son of the Grand Rebbe, the man who made the golem. So when this golem returns, among other things, he doesn't know that the Holocaust happened. He was also not properly unmade, so he believes that his allegiance, in the absence of the man who created him, is to his grandson, who so happens to be the Grand Rebbe, the 88-year-old leader of the very community that Miri grew up in and escaped from or left. So, I was able to kind of bring in all kinds of things. And I wrote this book in a little less than 4 months, which is pretty fast. I also was able to get the publisher. It's funny, I sold it pretty much right after I wrote it. And the publisher wanted to publish it quickly. They wanted to get it out fast because they felt that it was timely. And, I didn't have the heart to tell them that like anti-Semitism would still be around like in the spring. So it came out about 10 months after I sold it, which by publishing standards is very fast. The publisher's other great idea was they were like, we're going to publish the book just in time for the Jewish high holidays. And I was like, that doesn't mean what you guys think it means, like, I think in their world, like Yom Kippur is like a big gift buying day and everybody goes to the bookstore. So I had to kind of explain that to them. So yeah, that's a little bit about the book and the background and the golem. And I'd be happy to open it up now. I saw somebody in the chat.